This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 53, India, Old and New. It was natural and inevitable that Indian nationalism should resent alien rule, and yet it was curious how large numbers of our intelligentsia, to the end of the 19th century, accepted consciously or unconsciously the British ideology of empire. They built their own arguments on this, and only ventured to criticize some of its outward manifestations. The history and economics and other subjects that were taught in the schools and colleges were written entirely from the British imperial viewpoint, and laid stress on our numerous failings in the past and present, and the virtues and high destiny of the British. We accepted to some extent this distorted version, and even when we resisted it instinctively, we were influenced by it. At first, there was no intellectual escape from it, for we knew no other facts or arguments, and so we sought relief in religious nationalism, in the thought that at least in the sphere of religion and philosophy we were second to no other people. We comforted ourselves in our misfortune and degradation with the notion that though we did not possess the outward show and glitter of the West, we had the real inner article, which was far more valuable and worth having. Vivekanand and others, as well as the interest of Western scholars in our old philosophies, gave us a measure of self-respect again, and roused up our dormant pride in our past. Gradually we began to suspect and examine critically British statements about our past and present conditions, but still we thought and worked within the framework of British ideology. If a thing was bad, it would be called un-British. If a Britisher in India misbehaved, the fault was his, not that of the system. But the collection of this critical material of British rule in India, in spite of the moderate outlook of the authors, served a revolutionary purpose and gave a political and economic foundation to our nationalism. Dadabhai Nauroji's Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, and books by Ramesh Dutt and William Digby and others, thus played a revolutionary role in the development of our nationalist thought. Further researches in ancient Indian history revealed brilliant and highly civilized periods in the remote past, and we read of these with great satisfaction. We also discovered that the British record in India was very different from what we had been led to believe from their history books. Our challenge to the British version of history, economics, and administration in India grew, and yet we continued to function within the orbit of their ideology. That was the position of Indian nationalism as a whole at the turn of the century. That is still the position of the Liberal group and other small groups, as well as a number of moderate congressmen who go forward emotionally from time to time, but intellectually still live in the 19th century. Because of that, the Liberal is unable to grasp the idea of Indian freedom, for the two are fundamentally irreconcilable. He imagines that step by step he will go up to higher offices and will deal with fatter and more important files. The machinery of government will go on smoothly as before, only he will be at the hub, and somewhere in the background, without intruding themselves too much, will be the British Army to give him protection in case of need. That is his idea of dominion status within the empire. It is a naive notion impossible of achievement, for the price of British protection is Indian subjection. We cannot have it both ways, even if that was not degrading to the self-respect of a great country. Sir Frederick White, no partisan of Indian nationalism, says in a recent book, The Future of East and West, he, the Indian, still believes that England will stand between him and disaster, and as long as he cherishes this delusion, he cannot even lay the foundation of his own ideal of self-government. Evidently he refers to the liberal or the reactionary and communal types of Indians, largely with whom he must have come into contact when he was President of the Indian Legislative Assembly. This is not the Congress belief, much less is it that of other advanced groups. They agree with Sir Frederick, however, that there can be no freedom till this delusion goes, and India is left to face disaster, if that is her fate, by herself. The complete withdrawal of British military control of India will be the beginning of Indian freedom. It is not surprising that the Indian intelligentsia in the 19th century should have succumbed to British ideology. What is surprising is that some people should continue to suffer that delusion even after the stifling events and changes of the 20th century. In the 19th century, the British ruling classes were the aristocrats of the world, with a long record of wealth and success and power behind them. This long record and training gave them some of the virtues as well as failings of aristocracy. We in India can comfort ourselves with the thought that we helped substantially during the last century and 3/4 in providing the wherewithal and the training for this superior state. They began to think themselves, as so many races and nations have done, the chosen of God and their empire as an earthly kingdom of heaven. If their special position was acknowledged and their superiority not challenged, they were gracious and obliging, provided that this did them no harm. But opposition to them became opposition to the divine order, and as such was a deadly sin which must be suppressed. Monsieur André Siegfried has an interesting passage dealing with this aspect of British psychology in La crise britannique au XXe siècle. Note: quotation in French begins. Par l'habitude héréditaire du pouvoir jointe à la richesse, ils ont fini par contracter une manière d'être aristocratique, curieusement imbue de droits divins ethniques, et qui même a continué de s'accentuer quand déjà la suprématie britannique était contestée. Les jeunes générations de la fin du siècle, elles en arrivent à se dire inconsciemment que ce succès leur est dû. Cette façon d'interpréter les choses est intéressante à souligner, parce qu'elle éclaire dans ce défi particulièrement délicat les réactions de la psychologie britannique. On n'aura pas manqué de le remarquer. C'est dans des causes extérieures que l'Angleterre croit trouver la source de ses difficultés. Toujours, pour commencer, c'est la faute de quelqu'un d'autre, et si ce quelqu'un veut bien se réformer, l'Angleterre alors pourra retrouver sa prospérité. Toujours cet instinct de vouloir changer les autres au lieu de se changer soi-même. End of the quotation in French. If this was the general British attitude to the rest of the world, it was most conspicuous in India. There was something fascinating about the British approach to the Indian problem, even though it was singularly irritating. The calm assurance of always being in the right and of having borne a great burden worthily, faith in their racial destiny and their own brand of imperialism, contempt and anger at the unbelievers and sinners who challenged the foundations of the true faith. There was something of the religious temper about this attitude. Like the inquisitors of old, they were bent on saving us regardless of our desires in the matter. Incidentally, they profited by this traffic in virtue, thus demonstrating the truth of the old proverb, "Honesty is the best policy." The progress of India became synonymous with the adaptation of the country to the imperial scheme and the fashioning of chosen Indians after the British mould. The more we accepted British ideals and objectives, the fitter we were for self-government. Freedom would be ours as soon as we demonstrated and guaranteed that we would use it only in accordance with British wishes. Indians and Englishmen are, I am afraid, likely to disagree about the record of British rule in India. That is perhaps natural, but it does come as a shock when high British officials, including Secretaries of State for India, draw fanciful pictures of India's past and present and make statements which have no basis in fact. It is quite extraordinary how ignorant English people, apart from some experts and others, are about India. If facts elude them, how much more is the spirit of India beyond their reach? They seized her body and possessed her, but it was the possession of violence. They did not know her or try to know her. They never looked into her eyes, for theirs were averted and hers downcast through shame and humiliation. After centuries of contact, they face each other, strangers still, full of dislike for each other. And yet India, with all her poverty and degradation, had enough of nobility and greatness about her, and though she was overburdened with ancient tradition and present misery, and her eyelids were a little weary, she had a beauty wrought out from within upon the flesh, the deposit little cell by cell of strange thoughts and fantastic reveries and exquisite passions. Behind and within her battered body one could still glimpse a majesty of soul. Through long ages she had travelled and gathered much wisdom on the way, and trafficked with strangers and added them to her own big family, and witnessed days of glory and of decay, and suffered humiliation and terrible sorrow, and seen many a strange sight. But throughout her long journey she had clung to her immemorial culture, drawn strength and vitality from it, and shared it with other lands. Like a pendulum she had swung up and down. She had ventured with the daring of her thought to reach up to the heavens and unravel their mystery, and she had also had bitter experience of the pit of hell. Despite the woeful accumulations of superstition and degrading custom that had clung to her and borne her down, she had never wholly forgotten the inspiration that some of the wisest of her children at the dawn of history had given her in the Upanishads. Their keen minds, ever restless and ever striving and exploring, had not sought refuge in blind dogma or grown complacent in the routine observance of dead forms or ritual and creed. They had demanded not a personal relief from suffering in the present or a place in a paradise to come, but light and understanding. Lead me from the unreal to the real. Lead me from darkness to light. Lead me from death to immortality. From Brihad Aranyak Upanishad I 3:27. In the most famous of the prayers recited daily even today by millions, the Gayatri Mantra, the call is for knowledge, for enlightenment. Though often broken up politically, her spirit always guarded a common heritage, and in her diversity there was ever an amazing unity. Like all ancient lands, she was a curious mixture of the good and bad, but the good was hidden and had to be sought after, while the odour of decay was evident, and her hot, pitiless sun gave full publicity to the bad. Footnote: the greatest of all the contradictions in India is that over this diversity is spread a greater unity, which is not immediately evident because it failed historically to find expression in any political cohesion to make the country one, but which is so great a reality and so powerful that even the Mussulman world of India has to confess that it has been deeply affected by coming within its influence. Sir Frederick White, The Future of East and West. End of footnote. There is some similarity between Italy and India. Both are ancient countries with long traditions of culture behind them, though Italy is a newcomer compared to India, and India is a much vaster country. Both are split up politically, and yet the conception of Italia, like that of India, never died, and in all their diversity the unity was predominant. In Italy, the unity was largely a Roman unity, for that great city had dominated the country and been the fount and symbol of unity. In India there was no such single centre or dominant city, although Benares might well be called the eternal city of the East, not only for India but also for Eastern Asia. But unlike Rome, Benares never dabbled in empire or thought of temporal power. Indian culture was so widespread all over India that no part of the country could be called the heart of that culture. From Cape Comorin to Amarnath and Badrinath in the Himalayas, from Dwarka to Puri, the same ideas coursed, and if there was a clash of ideas in one place, the noise of it soon reached distant parts of the country. Just as Italy gave the gift of culture and religion to Western Europe, India did so to Eastern Asia, though China was as old and venerable as India. And even when Italy was lying prostrate, politically, her life coursed through the veins of Europe. It was Metternich who called Italy a geographical expression, and many a would-be Metternich has used that phrase for India, and strangely enough, there is a similarity even in their geographical positions in the two continents. More interesting is the comparison of England with Austria, for has not England of the 20th century been compared to Austria of the 19th, proud and haughty and imposing still, but with the roots that gave strength shrivelling up and decay eating its way into the mighty fabric? It is curious how one cannot resist the tendency to give an anthropomorphic form to a country. Such is the force of habit and early associations. India becomes Bharat Mata, Mother India, a beautiful lady, very old but ever youthful in appearance, sad-eyed and forlorn, cruelly treated by aliens and outsiders, and calling upon her children to protect her. Some such picture rouses the emotions of hundreds of thousands and drives them to action and sacrifice. And yet India is in the main, the peasant and the worker, not beautiful to look at, for poverty is not beautiful. Does the beautiful lady of our imaginations represent the bare-bodied and bent workers in the fields and factories? Or the small group of those who have from ages past crushed the masses and exploited them, imposed cruel customs on them, and made many of them even untouchable? We seek to cover truth by the creatures of our imaginations and endeavor to escape from reality to a world of dreams. And yet despite these different classes and their mutual conflicts, there was a common bond which united them in India, and one is amazed at its persistence and tenacity and enduring vitality. What was this strength due to? Not merely the passive strength and weight of inertia and tradition, great as these always are. There was an active sustaining principle, for it resisted successfully powerful outside influences and absorbed internal forces that rose to combat it. And yet, with all its strength, it could not preserve political freedom or endeavor to bring about political unity. These latter do not appear to have been considered worth much trouble. Their importance was very foolishly ignored, and we have suffered for this neglect. Right through history, the old Indian ideal did not glorify political and military triumph, and it looked down upon money and the professional money-making class. Honor and wealth did not go together, and honor was meant to go, at least in theory, to the men who served the community, with little in the shape of financial reward. The old culture managed to live through many a fierce storm and tempest, but though it kept its outer form, it lost its real content. Today it is fighting silently and desperately against a new and all-powerful opponent, the Baniya civilization of the capitalist West. It will succumb to this newcomer, for the West brings science, and science brings food for the hungry millions. But the West also brings an antidote to the evils of this cutthroat civilization, the principles of socialism, of cooperation, and service to the community for the common good. This is not so unlike the old Brahmin ideal of service, but it means the Brahminization, not in the religious sense of course, of all classes and groups and the abolition of class distinctions. It may be that when India puts on her new garment as she must, for the old is torn and tattered, she will have it cut in this fashion, so as to make it conform both to present conditions and her old thought. The ideas she adopts must become racy to her soil. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54. The Record of British Rule. What has been the record of British rule in India? I doubt if it is possible for any Indian or Englishman to take an objective and dispassionate view of this long record, and even if this were possible, it would be still more difficult to weigh and measure the psychological and other immaterial factors. We are told that British rule has given to India that which throughout the centuries she never possessed, a government whose authority is unquestioned in any part of the subcontinent. It has established the rule of law and a just and efficient administration. It has brought to India Western conceptions of parliamentary government and personal liberties. And by transforming British India into a single unitary state, it has engendered amongst Indians a sense of political unity, and thus fostered the first beginnings of nationalism. Footnote. The quotations are from the report of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Indian Constitutional Reform, 1934. End of footnote. That is the British case, and there is much truth in it, though the rule of law and personal liberties have not been evident for many years. The Indian survey of this period lays stress on many other factors, and points out the injury, material and spiritual, that foreign rule has brought us. The viewpoint is so different that sometimes the very thing that is commended by the British is condemned by Indians. As Dr. Anand Kumaraswamy writes, one of the most remarkable features of British rule in India is that the greatest injuries inflicted upon the Indian people have the outward appearance of blessings. As a matter of fact, the changes that have taken place in India during the last century or more have been world changes common to most countries in the East and West. The growth of industrialism in Western Europe and later on in the rest of the world brought nationalism and the strong unitary state in its train everywhere. The British can take credit for having first opened India's window to the West and brought her one aspect of Western industrialism and science, but having done so, they throttled the further industrial growth of the country till circumstances forced their hands. India was already the meeting place of two cultures, the Western Asiatic culture of Islam and the Eastern, her own product, which spread to the Far East. And now a third and more powerful impulse came from further west, and India became a focal point and a battleground for various old and new ideas. There can be no doubt that this third impulse would have triumphed and thus solved many of India's old problems. But the British, who had themselves helped in bringing it, tried to stop its further progress. They prevented our industrial growth and thus delayed our political growth and preserved all the out-of-date feudal and other relics they could find in the country. They even froze up our changing and to some extent progressing laws and customs at the stage they found them and made it difficult for us to get out of their shackles. It was not with their goodwill or assistance that the bourgeoisie grew in India. But after introducing the railway and other products of industrialism, they could not stop the wheel of change. They could only check it and slow it down, and this they did to their own manifest advantage. On this solid foundation, the majestic structure of the government of India rests, and it can be claimed with certainty that in the period which has elapsed since 1858, when the Crown assumed supremacy over all the territories of the East India Company, the educational and material progress of India has been greater than it was ever within her power to achieve during any other period of her long and checkered history. Report of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, 1934. This statement is not so self-evident as it appears to be, and it has often been stated that literacy actually went down with the coming of British rule. But even if the statement was wholly true, it amounts to a comparison of the modern industrial age with past ages. In almost every country in the world, the educational and material progress has been tremendous during the past century because of science and industrialism, and it may be said with assurance of any such country that progress of this kind has been greater than was ever within her power to achieve during any other period of her long and checkered history, though perhaps that country's history may not be a long one in comparison with Indian history. Are we needlessly cantankerous and perverse if we suggest that some such technical progress would have come to us anyhow in this industrial age, and even without British rule? And indeed, if we compare our lot with many other countries, may we not hazard the guess that such progress might have been greater, for we have had to contend against a stifling of that progress by the British themselves? Railways, telegraphs, telephones, wireless and the like are hardly tests of the goodness or beneficence of British rule. They were welcome and necessary, and because the British happened to be the agents who brought them first, we should be grateful to them. But even these heralds of industrialism came to us primarily for the strengthening of British rule. They were the veins and arteries through which the nation's blood should have coursed, increasing its trade, carrying its produce, and bringing new life and wealth to its millions. It is true that in the long run some such result was likely, but they were designed and worked for another purpose, to strengthen the imperial hold and to capture markets for British goods, which they succeeded in achieving. I am all in favor of industrialization and the latest methods of transport, but sometimes, as I rushed across the Indian plains, the railway, that life-giver, has almost seemed to me like iron bands confining and imprisoning India. The British conception of ruling India was the police conception of the state. Government's job was to protect the state and leave the rest to others. Their public finance dealt with military expenditure, police, civil administration, interest on debt. The economic needs of the citizens were not looked after, and were sacrificed to British interests. The cultural and other needs of the people, except for a tiny handful, were entirely neglected. The changing conceptions of public finance, which brought free and universal education, improvement of public health, care of poor and feeble-minded, insurance of workers against illness, old age and unemployment, etc., in other countries, were almost entirely beyond the ken of the government. It could not indulge in these spending activities, for its tax system was most regressive, taking a much larger proportion of small incomes than of the larger ones, and its expenditure on its protective and administrative functions was terribly heavy and swallowed up most of the revenue. The outstanding feature of British rule was their concentration on everything that went to strengthen their political and economic hold on the country. Everything else was incidental. If they built up a powerful central government and an efficient police force, that was an achievement for which they can take credit, but the Indian people can hardly congratulate themselves on it. Unity is a good thing, but unity in subjection is hardly a thing to be proud of. The very strength of a despotic government may become a greater burden for a people, and a police force, no doubt useful in many ways, can be, and has been often enough, turned against the very people it is supposed to protect. Bertrand Russell, comparing modern civilization with the old Greek, has recently written, "The only serious superiority of Greek civilization as compared to ours was the inefficiency of the police, which enabled a larger proportion of decent people to escape. Britain's supremacy in India brought us peace, and India was certainly in need of peace after the troubles and misfortunes that followed the break-up of the Mughal Empire. Peace is a precious commodity, necessary for any progress, and it was welcome to us when it came. But even peace can be purchased at too great a price, and we can have the perfect peace of the grave, and the absolute safety of a cage or of prison, or peace may be the sodden despair of men unable to better themselves. The peace which is imposed by an alien conqueror has hardly the restful and soothing qualities of the real article. War is a terrible thing, and to be avoided, but it does encourage some virtues, which, according to William James, the psychologist, are fidelity, cohesiveness, tenacity, heroism, conscience, education, inventiveness, economy, and physical health and vigor. Because of this, James sought for a moral equivalent of war, which, without the horrors of war, would encourage these virtues in a community. Perhaps if he had learnt of non-cooperation and civil disobedience, he would have found something after his own heart, a moral and peaceful equivalent of war. It is a futile task to consider the ifs and possibilities of history. I feel sure that it was a good thing for India to come in contact with the scientific and industrial West. Science was the great gift of the West, and India lacked this, and without it she was doomed to decay. The manner of our contacts was unfortunate, and yet perhaps only a succession of violent shocks could shake us out of our torpor. From this point of view, the Protestant, individualistic Anglo-Saxon English were suitable, for they were more different from us than most other Westerners, and could give us greater shocks. They gave us political unity, and that was a desirable thing, but whether we had this unity or not, Indian nationalism would have grown and demanded that unity. The Arab world is today split up into a large number of separate states, independent, protected, mandatory, and the like, but throughout all of them runs the desire for Arab unity. There can be no doubt that Arab nationalism would largely achieve this unity if Western imperialist powers did not stand in the way. But as in India, it is the purpose of these powers to encourage disruptive tendencies and create minority problems which weaken and partly counteract the nationalist urge and give an excuse to the imperialist power to stay on and pose as the impartial arbitrator. The political unity of India was achieved incidentally as a side product of the empire's advance. In later years, when that unity allied itself to nationalism and challenged alien rule, we witnessed the deliberate promotion of disunity and sectarianism formidable obstacles to our future progress. What a long time it is since the British came here, a century and 3/4 since they became dominant. They had a free hand, as despotic governments have, and a magnificent opportunity to mold India according to their desire. During these years, the world has changed out of all recognition: England, Europe, America, Japan. The insignificant American colonies bordering the Atlantic in the 18th century constitute today the wealthiest, the most powerful, and technically the most advanced nation. Japan, within a brief span, has undergone amazing changes. The vast territories of the USSR, where till only yesterday the dead hand of the Tsar's government suppressed and stifled all growth, now pulsate with a new life and build a new world before our eyes. There have been big changes in India also, and the country is very different from what it was in the 18th century: railways, irrigation works, factories, schools and colleges, huge government offices, etc., etc. And yet, in spite of these changes, what is India like today? A servile state, with its splendid strength caged up, hardly daring to breathe freely, governed by strangers from afar. Her people poor beyond compare, short-lived and incapable of resisting disease and epidemic, illiteracy rampant, vast areas devoid of all sanitary or medical provision, unemployment on a prodigious scale, both among the middle classes and the masses. Freedom, democracy, socialism, communism are, we are told, the slogans of unpractical idealists, doctrinaires, or knaves. The test must be one of the well-being of the people as a whole. That is indeed a vital test, and by that test India makes a terribly poor show today. We read of great schemes of unemployment relief and the alleviation of distress in other countries. What of our scores of millions of unemployed and the distress that is widespread and permanent? We read also of housing schemes elsewhere. Where are the houses of hundreds of millions of our people who live in mud huts or have no shelter at all? May we not envy the lot of other countries where education, sanitation, medical relief, cultural facilities and production advance rapidly ahead while we remain where we were or plod wearily along at the pace of a snail? Russia, in a brief dozen years of wonderful effort, has almost ended illiteracy in her vast territories and has evolved a fine and up-to-date system of education in touch with the life of the masses. Backward Turkey, under the Ataturk Mustafa Kemal's leadership, has also made giant strides towards widespread literacy. Fascist Italy, on the very threshold of its career, attacked illiteracy with vigor. Gentile, the education minister, called for a frontal attack on illiteracy. That gangrenous plague which is rotting our body politic must be extirpated with a hot iron. Hard words, unseemly for a drawing room, but they show the conviction and energy behind the thought. We are politer here and use more rounded phrases. We move warily and exhaust our energies in commissions and committees. Indians have been accused of talking too much and doing little. It is a just charge. But may we not express our wonder at the inexhaustible capacity of the British for committees and commissions, each of which, after long labor, produces a learned report, a great state document which is duly praised and pigeonholed. And so we get the sensation of moving ahead, of progress, and yet have the advantage of remaining where we were. Honor is satisfied, and vested interests remain untouched and secure. Other countries discuss how to get on. We discuss checks and brakes and safeguards lest we go too fast. The imperial splendor became the measure of the people's poverty, so we are told, by the Joint Parliamentary Committee 1934 of the Mughal Times. It is a just observation, but may we not apply the same measure today? What of New Delhi today, with its vice-regal pomp and pageantry, and the provincial governors with all their ostentation? And all this with a background of abject and astonishing poverty. The contrast hurts, and it is a little difficult to imagine how sensitive men can put up with it. India today is a poor and dismal sight behind all the splendors of the imperial frontage. There is a great deal of patchwork and superficiality, and behind it the unhappy petty bourgeoisie, crushed more and more by modern conditions. Further back come the workers, living miserably in grinding poverty, and then the peasant, that symbol of India, whose lot it is to be born to endless night. Bowed by the weight of centuries, he leans upon his hoe and gazes on the ground, the emptiness of ages on his face, and on his back the burden of the world. Through this dread shape the suffering ages look. Time's tragedy is in that aching stoop. Through this dread shape humanity betrayed, plundered, profaned and disinherited, cries protest to the powers that made the world, a protest that is also prophecy. Footnote: these extracts are from the American poet E. Markham's poem The Man with the Hoe. End of footnote. It would be absurd to cast the blame for all India's ills on the British. That responsibility must be shouldered by us, and we may not shirk it. It is unseemly to blame others for the inevitable consequences of our own weaknesses. An authoritarian system of government, and especially one that is foreign, must encourage a psychology of subservience and try to limit the mental outlook and horizon of the people. It must crush much that is finest in youth, enterprise, spirit of adventure, originality, pep, and encourage sneakishness, rigid conformity, and a desire to cringe and please the bosses. Such a system does not bring out the real service mentality, the devotion to public service or to ideals. It picks out the least public-spirited persons whose sole objective is to get on in life. We see what a class the British attract to themselves in India. Some of them are intellectually keen and capable of good work. They drift to government service or semi-government service because of lack of opportunity elsewhere, and gradually they tone down and become just parts of the big machine, their minds imprisoned by the dull routine of work. They develop the qualities of a bureaucracy, a competent knowledge of clerkship, and the diplomatic art of keeping office. At the highest, they have a massive devotion to the public service. There is, or can be, no flaming enthusiasm. That is not possible under a foreign government. But apart from these, the majority of petty officials are not an admirable lot, for they have only learnt to cringe to their superiors and bully their inferiors. The fault is not theirs. That is the training the system gives them. And if sycophancy and nepotism flourish, as they often do, is it to be wondered at? They have no ideals in service. The haunting fear of unemployment and consequent starvation pursues them, and their chief concern is to hold on to their jobs and get other jobs for their relatives and friends. Where the spy and that most odious of creatures, the informer, always hover in the background, it is not easy to develop the more desirable virtues in a people. Recent developments have made it even more difficult for sensitive, public-spirited men to join government service. The government does not want them, and they do not wish to associate with it too closely unless compelled by economic circumstance. But, as all the world knows, it is the white man who bears the burden of empire, not the brown. We have various imperial services to carry on the imperial tradition, and a sufficiency of safeguards to protect their special privileges, all, we are told, in the interests of India. It is remarkable how the good of India seems to be tied up with the obvious interest and advancement of these services. If any privilege or prize post of the Indian civil service is taken away, we are told that inefficiency and corruption will result. If the reserved jobs for the Indian medical service are reduced, this becomes a menace to India's health. And of course, if the British element in the army is touched, all manner of terrible perils confront us. I think there is some truth in this, that if the superior officials suddenly went away and left their departments in charge of their subordinates, there would be a fall in efficiency. But that is because the whole system has been built this way, and the subordinates are not by any means the best men, nor have they ever been made to shoulder responsibility. I feel convinced that there is abundant good material in India, and it could be available within a fairly short period if proper steps were taken. But that means a complete change in our governmental and social outlook. It means a new state. As it is, we are told that whatever changes in the constitutional apparatus may come our way, The rigid framework of the great services which guard and shelter us will continue as before. Hierophants of the sacred mysteries of government, they will guard the temple and prevent the vulgar from entering its holy precincts. Gradually, as we make ourselves worthy of the privilege, they will remove the veils one after another, till, in some future age, even the Holy of Holies stands uncovered to our wondering and reverent eyes. Of all these imperial services the Indian civil service holds first place, and to it must largely go the credit or discredit for the functioning of government in India. We have been frequently told of the many virtues of this service, and its greatness in the imperial scheme has almost become a maxim. Its unchallenged position of authority in India, with the almost autocratic power that this gives, as well as the praise and boosting which it receives in ample measure, cannot be wholly good for the mental equilibrium of any individual or group. With all my admiration for the service, I am afraid I must admit that it is peculiarly susceptible, both individually and as a whole, to that old and yet somewhat modern disease, paranoia. It would be idle to deny the good qualities of the ICS, for we are not allowed to forget them, but so much bunkum has been and is said about the service that I sometimes feel that a little debunking would be desirable. The American economist Veblen has called the privileged classes the kept classes. I think it would be equally true to call the ICS, as well as the other imperial services, the kept services. They are a very expensive luxury. Major D. Graham Pole, formerly a Labour member of the British Parliament and one who is greatly interested in Indian affairs, writing in the Modern Review some time ago, stated that no one has ever tried to dispute the fact that the ICS is a most able and efficient service. As similar statements are frequently made in England and believed, it is worthwhile examining this. It is always unsafe to make such positive and definite statements which can easily be disproved, and Major Graham Pole is entirely wrong in imagining that the fact has not been disputed. It has been frequently challenged and disputed, and long ago even Mr. G.K. Gokhale said many hard things about the ICS. The average Indian, congressman or non-congressman, would certainly join issue with Major Graham Pole. And yet it is possible that both may be partly right and may be thinking of different qualifications. Ability and efficiency for what? If this ability and efficiency are to be measured from the point of view of strengthening the British Empire in India and helping it to exploit the country, the ICS may certainly claim to have done well. If, however, the test is the well-being of the Indian masses, they have signally failed, and their failure becomes even more noticeable when one sees the enormous distance that separates them in regard to income and standards of living from the masses they are meant to serve, and from whom ultimately their varied emoluments come. It is perfectly true that the service has, as a whole, kept up a certain standard, though that standard is necessarily one of mediocrity and has occasionally thrown up exceptional men. More could hardly be expected of any such service. It embodied essentially the British public school spirit, with all its good and bad points, though many of the members of the ICS now are not public school men. Though it kept up a good standard, it disapproved strongly of nonconformity with the type, and special abilities of individual members lost themselves in the dull routine of the day's work, and to some extent in the fear of appearing different from the others. There were many earnest members, many with a conception of service, but it was service of the empire, and India came only as a bad second. Trained and circumstanced as they were, they could only act in that way. Because they were few in numbers, surrounded by an alien and often unfriendly people, they held together and kept up a certain standard. The prestige, both of race and office, demanded this. And because they had largely autocratic powers, they resented all criticism, considered it one of the major sins, became more and more intolerant and pedagogic, and developed many of the failings of irresponsible rulers. They were self-satisfied and self-sufficient, narrow and fixed minds, static in a changing world, and wholly unsuited to a progressive environment. When abler and more adaptable minds than theirs tackled the Indian problem, they resented this, called them offensive names, suppressed them, and threw every possible obstacle in their way. And when post-war changes brought dynamic conditions, they were wholly at sea and unable to adapt themselves to them. Their limited hidebound education had not fitted them for such emergencies and novel situations. They had been spoiled by a long spell of irresponsibility. As a group, they had practically absolute power, subject only in theory to a control by the British Parliament. Power corrupts, Lord Acton has told us, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They were on the whole reliable officers in their limited way, doing their day-to-day work fairly competently, without brilliance. But their very training was such that a wholly unexpected situation found them wanting, although their self-confidence, their methodical nature, and their esprit de corps helped them to tide over immediate difficulties. The famous Mesopotamia muddle exposed the British Indian government for its inefficiency and woodenness, but many a similar muddle does not see the light of day. Even their reaction to civil disobedience was crude. To shoot and club may dispose of the opponents for a while, but it does not solve any problem, and it undermines that very feeling of superiority which it is meant to protect. It was not surprising that they had recourse to violence to meet a growing and aggressive nationalist movement. That was inevitable, for empires rest on that, and they had been taught no other way of meeting opposition. But the fact that excessive and unnecessary violence was used showed that they had lost all grip of the situation, and no longer possessed the self-control and restraint which they seemed to have in normal times. Nerves frequently gave way, and even in their public utterances there was a trace of hysteria. The calm confidence of other days was gone. A crisis has a pitiless way of showing us all up and exposing our innermost weaknesses. Civil disobedience was such a crisis and test, and very few on either side of the barricade, Congress or government, survived fully that test. In a crisis, the number of men and women of really first-class caliber is found to be small, says Mr. Lloyd George, and the rest do not count in a crisis. The hummocks that look like eminences in fine weather are quickly submerged in a great flood when the highest peaks alone are visible above the surface of the waters. The ICS were intellectually and emotionally not prepared for what happened. The original training of many of their members was classical, which gave them a certain culture and a certain charm. It was an old-world attitude suitable for the Victorian age, but utterly out of place under modern conditions. They lived in a narrow, circumscribed world of their own, Anglo-Indian, which was neither England nor India. They had no appreciation of the forces at work in contemporary society. In spite of their amusing assumption of being the trustees and guardians of the Indian masses, they knew little about them, and even less about the new aggressive bourgeoisie. They judged Indians from the sycophants and office-seekers who surrounded them, and dismissed others as agitators and knaves. Their knowledge of post-war changes all over the world, and especially in the economic sphere, was of the slightest, and they were too much in the ruts to adjust themselves to changing conditions. They did not realize that the order they represented was out of date under modern conditions, and that they were approaching as a group more and more the type which T.S. Eliot describes in The Hollow Men. And yet that order will continue so long as British imperialism continues, and this is powerful enough still, and has able and resourceful leaders. The British government in India is like a tooth that is decaying, but is still strongly embedded. It is painful, but it cannot be easily pulled out. The pain is likely to continue, and even grow worse, till the tooth is taken out or falls out itself. The public school type has had its day even in England, and does not occupy the same place as it did, although it is still prominent in public affairs. In India, it is still more out of place, and it can never fit in or cooperate with an aggressive nationalism, much less with those working for social change. There are, of course, many excellent men, both English and Indian, in the ICS, but, so long as the present system prevails, Their excellence will be devoted to objects which are not beneficial to the Indian people. Some Indian members of the service are so overcome by this public school spirit that they become plus royalistes que le roi. I remember meeting a youthful Indian member of the ICS who had a very high opinion of himself, which unfortunately I could not share. He pointed out to me the many virtues of his service and ended up by the unanswerable argument in favor of the British Empire. Was it not better than the Roman Empire and the empires of Genghis Khan and Timur? The underlying assumption of the ICS is that they discharge their duties most efficiently, and therefore they can lay every stress on their claims, and the claims are many and varied. If India is poor, that is the fault of her social customs, her banyas and money-lenders, and above all, her enormous population. The greatest banya of all, the British government in India, is conveniently ignored. And what they propose to do about this population I do not know, for in spite of a great deal of help received from famines, epidemics, and a high death rate generally, the population is still overwhelming. Birth control is proposed, and I, for one, am entirely in favor of the spread of the knowledge and methods of birth control. But the use of these methods itself requires a much higher standard of living for the masses, some measure of general education, and innumerable clinics all over the country. Under present conditions, birth control methods are completely out of reach for the masses. The middle classes can profit by them, as I believe they are doing to a growing extent. But this argument of overpopulation is deserving of further notice. The problem today all over the world is not one of lack of food or lack of other essentials, but actually lack of mouths to feed, or, to put it differently, lack of capacity to buy food, etc., for those who are in need. Even in India, considered apart, there is no lack of food, and though the population has gone up, the food supply has increased and can increase more proportionately than the population. Then again, the much advertised increase of population in India has been, except in the last decade, at a much lower rate than in most Western countries. It is true that in future the difference will be greater, for various forces are tending to lessen or even stop population increase in Western countries. But limiting factors are likely to check population increase in India also soon. Whenever India becomes free and in a position to build her new life as she wants to, she will necessarily require the best of her sons and daughters for this purpose. Good human material is always rare, and in India it is rarer still because of our lack of opportunities under British rule. We shall want the help of many foreign experts in many departments of public activity, particularly in those which require special technical and scientific knowledge. Among those who have served in the ICS or other imperial services there will be many, Indians or foreigners, who will be necessary and welcome to the new order. But of one thing I am quite sure, that no new order can be built up in India so long as the spirit of the ICS pervades our administration and our public services. That spirit of authoritarianism is the ally of imperialism, and it cannot coexist with freedom. It will either succeed in crushing freedom or will be swept away itself. Only with one type of state it is likely to fit in, and that is the fascist type. Therefore, it seems to me quite essential that the ICS and similar services must disappear completely, as such, before we can start real work on a new order. Individual members of these services, if they are willing and competent for the new job, will be welcome, but only on new conditions. It is quite inconceivable that they will get the absurdly high salaries and allowances that are paid to them today. The new India must be served by earnest, efficient workers who have an ardent faith in the cause they serve and are bent on achievement, and who work for the joy and glory of it, and not for the attraction of high salaries. The money motive must be reduced to a minimum. The need for foreign helpers will be considerable, but I imagine that the least wanted will be civil administrators who have no technical knowledge. There will be no lack of such people in India. I have previously stated how the Indian liberals and other groups like them have accepted British ideology with reference to the government of India. This is especially noticeable in regard to the services, for their cry is for Indianization and not for radical change of the spirit and nature of the services and the state structure. This is a vital matter on which it is impossible to give in, for Indian freedom is bound up not only with the withdrawal of British forces and services, but also with the elimination of the authoritarian spirit that inspired them, and a levelling down of their salaries and privileges. There is a great deal of talk of safeguards in these days of constitution making. If these safeguards are to be in the interests of India, they should lay down, among other things, that the ICS and similar services should cease to exist in their present form and with the powers and privileges they possess, and should have nothing to do with the new constitution. Even more mysterious and formidable are the so-called defense services. We may not criticize them, we may not say anything about them, for what do we know about such matters? We must only pay, and pay heavily, without murmuring. A short while ago, in September 1934, Sir Philip Chetwode, the Commander-in-Chief in India, speaking in the Council of State at Shimla, told Indian politicians in pungent military language to mind their own business and not interfere with his. Referring to the mover of an amendment to some proposition, he said, "Do he and his friends think that a war-worn and war-wise race like the British, who won their empire at the point of the sword and have kept it by the sword ever since, are to be talked out of war wisdom which that experience brings to a nation by armchair critics?" He made many other interesting remarks, and we were informed, lest we might think that he had spoken in the heat of the moment, that he had carefully written out his speech and spoke from a manuscript. It is, of course, an impertinence for a layman to argue about military matters with a commander-in-chief, and yet perhaps even an armchair critic might be permitted to make a few observations. It is conceivable that the interests of those who hold the empire by the sword and those over whose heads this shining weapon ever hangs might differ. It is possible that an Indian army might be made to serve Indian interests or to serve imperial interests, and the two might differ or even conflict with each other. A politician and an armchair critic might also wonder if the claims of eminent generals for freedom from interference are valid after the experiences of the World War. They had a free field then to a large extent, and from all accounts they made a terrible mess of almost everything in every army, British, French, German, Austrian, Italian, Russian. Captain Liddell Hart, the distinguished British military historian and strategist, writes in his History of the World War that at one stage in the war, while British soldiers fought the enemy, British generals fought one another. The national peril did not bring unity of thought or effort. The war, he continues, has shattered our faith in idols, our hero-worshipping belief that great men are different clay from common men. Leaders are still necessary, perhaps more necessary, but our awakened realization of their common humanity is a safeguard against either expecting from them or trusting in them too much. That arch politician, Mr. David Lloyd George, has painted in his war memoirs a terrible picture of the failings and blunders of the generals and admirals in the World War, blunders which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. England and her allies won the war, but it was a blood-stained stagger to victory. The reckless and unintelligent handling of men and situations by the high officers brought England almost to the rim of catastrophe, and she and her allies were saved largely by the incredible folly of their foes. So writes the great War Premier of Britain, and he explains how he had to undertake surgical operations in order to get ideas into Lord Jellicoe's head, especially in regard to the proposal for having a convoy system. Of the French Marshal Joffre, he seems to think that his chief virtue was the possession of a resolute countenance which inspired a sense of strength. That is what harassed people instinctively seek in trouble. They make the mistake of thinking that the seat of intelligence is in the chin. But Mr. Lloyd George's main indictment is against the British High Command itself, the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Haig. He demonstrates how Lord Haig's inordinate vanity and refusal to listen to politicians and others made him conceal important facts from the British cabinet itself, and led the British army in France to one of its greatest disasters. And even when failure stared him in the face, obstinate to the last, he continued his ill-advised offensive for several months in that awful mud of Passchendaele and Cambrai, till 17,000 officers alone lay dead and dying, and 400,000 gallant British soldiers were casualties. It is well that the unknown soldier is honoured today after his death. His life was cheap, and he had little consideration when he was alive. Politicians, like all other people, err frequently, but democratic politicians have to be sensitive and responsive to men and events, and they usually realize their mistakes and try to repair them. The soldier is bred in a different atmosphere, where authority reigns and criticism is not tolerated. So he resents the advice of others, and when he errs thoroughly and persists in error. For him, the chin is more important than the mind or brain. In India, we have the advantage of having produced a mixed type, for the civil administration itself has grown up and lives in a semi-military atmosphere of authority and self-sufficiency, and possesses therefore to a great extent the soldier's chin and other virtues. We are told that the process of Indianization of the army is being pushed on, and in another 30 years or more an Indian general might even appear on the Indian stage. It is possible that in not much more than 100 years the process of Indianization might be considerably advanced. One is apt to wonder how, in a moment of crisis, England built up a mighty army of millions within a year or two. If it had possessed our mentors, perhaps it would have proceeded more cautiously and warily. It is possible, of course, that the war would have been over long before this soundly trained army was ready for it. One thinks also of the Russian Soviet armies growing out of almost nothing and facing and triumphing over a host of enemies, and today constituting one of the most efficient fighting machines in the world. They did not apparently possess war-worn and war-wise generals to advise them. We have now a military academy at Dehradun, where gentlemen cadets are trained to become officers. They are very smart on parade, we are told, and they will no doubt make admirable officers. But I wonder sometimes what purpose this training serves, unless it is accompanied by technical training. Infantry and cavalry are about as much use today as the Roman phalanx, and the rifle is little better than a bow and arrow in an age of air warfare, gas bombs, tanks, and powerful artillery. No doubt their trainers and mentors realize this. What has been the record of British rule in India? Who are we to complain of its deficiencies when they were but the consequences of our own failings? If we lose touch with the river of change and enter a backwater, become self-centered and self-satisfied, and, ostrich-like, ignore what happens elsewhere, we do so at our peril. The British came to us on the crest of a wave of new impulse in the world, and represented mighty historic forces which they themselves hardly realized. Are we to complain of the cyclone that uproots us and hurls us about, or the cold wind that makes us shiver? Let us have done with the past and its bickering and face the future. To the British we must be grateful for one splendid gift of which they were the bearers, the gift of science and its rich offspring. It is difficult, however, to forget or view with equanimity the efforts of the British government in India to encourage the disruptive, obscurantist, reactionary, sectarian, and opportunist elements in the country. Perhaps that too is a needed test and challenge for us, and before India is reborn it will have to go through again and again the fire that cleanses and tempers and burns up the weak, the impure, and the corrupt. End of chapter 54.